Hello, welcome to the 20th aphorism of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. In the last sequence, Nietzsche took on an examination of the supposed simplicity of the will in an attempt to critique and sort of break it open so that the complexities and multiplicities, the various different aspects of the will could be examined in greater detail. Nietzsche accuses German philosophers of the time, specifically idealists, of oversimplifying, not exclusively idealists, but including them, uh, accusing them of oversimplifying the will in order to preserve a sense of agency and freedom and singular responsibility. These ideas will come up again in the future. But in number 20 here, he's going to talk about some interesting concepts, so let's get into it. First off, Nietzsche's going to sound a little bit like Hegel for a while, and he says this that individual philosophical concepts are not arbitrary and do not grow up on their own, but rather grow in reference and relation to each other. That, however suddenly and randomly they seem to emerge in the history of thought, these thoughts they still belong to a system just as much as all the members of the fauna of a continent do. This is ultimately revealed by the certainty with which the most diverse philosophers will always fill out a definite basic scheme of possible philosophies. So, what is Nietzsche doing here? First of all, he is trying to relate the emergence of ideas or thoughts to something that is physical, the systematicity of a fauna of a continent, so plant life. Right? So Nietzsche's going to understand the way that these things emerge. The mind should be treated no differently. The reason why the thoughts emerge in our mind have specific reasons. We are having these thoughts for reasons, and they recur over time in history. There's even a sort of cyclical nature to it, which he's going to get into. What does that mean? Well, thinkers from totally different cultures and places of the world will end up sounding very similar in their particular philosophies. Nietzsche will bring this up in a second. Let's keep reading. Under an invisible spell, philosophers will each start out anew, seemingly anew, only to end up revolving in the same orbit once again. So we try to have new thought, we follow this line of logic or reasoning in a certain way, until it starts to look oddly familiar to us, it leads us to a familiar position. Why does this happen? Well, Nietzsche's trying to say there's something about thinking that causes it to work this way. But not just thinking, also possibly the world, the environment, all sorts of stimuli and affects that are causing the mind to think in this way, including language. Language will be an important determining factor in the repetition of these ideas. So, um, however independent of each other they might feel themselves to be, with their critical or systematic wills, something inside of them drives them on, something leads them into a particular order, one after the other. And this something is precisely the innate systematicity and relationship of concepts. Concepts themselves have a nature. I'm paraphrasing now, not reading, but concepts themselves have such a nature that they're going to emerge in a certain and specific way. They have a systematicity to them, and so it isn't surprising that, for example, Schopenhauer is going to come to a somewhat similar conclusion regarding the nature of the will and the nature of suffering, as did other philosophers throughout the world, like the Upanishads in India or Buddhism. Upanishads not being Buddhistic but Hinduistic, so Hinduism and Buddhism have some similarities in terms of their philosophy, and these similarities are not unique to Indian philosophy or religions. They also can be found in other philosophers throughout the world. Philosophers often repeat each other over time. Someone, I forgot who said this, but Plato being the all of history being footnotes to Plato is an exaggeration, but you can take any philosophical idea in modern times and you can quite easily find a tangent connected to something Plato would have talked about, some sort of philosophical problem. And the reason why is because our minds, according to Nietzsche, aren't as complex as we often take them to be, especially our own free thinking. We aren't as special or as unique as we think we are. And so, oftentimes, philosophers are just leading us to the same old conclusions that other philosophers have been leading us to for a long time. So, in fact, their thinking is not nearly as much a discovery of some sort of new thing as it is a recognition, a re-seeing something. Oh, yes, I'm seeing this again. It's a remembrance. Remembrance is a key term in Plato as well. This goes back a long times of returning, a type of homecoming. Heidegger's philosophy is very much a type of returning or homecoming where he's trying to forget or undo a lot of the work that philosophical knowledge has done in order to see what is new, in order to try and come up with something genuinely new and stop repeating the same old philosophical tricks and terms and ideas over and over again. Nietzsche's saying here that the act of doing philosophy involves something more complex than just accumulating knowledge. So thinking is not just a matter of discovering new things and then adding new things onto new things infinitely, like the sort of quantitative accumulation of knowledge over time, the way one would accumulate money or something else. Instead, Nietzsche is saying that there's a cyclical element to philosophy uniquely as such, which is to say the process of thinking will go through repetitious cycles in most cases. So, to this extent, philosophizing is a type of atavism of the highest order. And atavism means a type of primordial returnings to something essential about the human mind. I always love this about philosophy, is how much I find myself able to relate to thinkers from so long ago. This is not nearly as easy in other disciplines. Literature, I find myself very much alienated from a lot of other people from other cultures. I find it very difficult to empathize with them. But reading philosophy, for me, it's a type of connection that is, in my opinion, exceptionally unique. I valued this connection for a long time. To return to the same ideas 2,500 years later, referring to the Greeks, of course, is a refreshing testament to the what I always thought was the legitimacy of philosophy. I thought the fact that we could agree upon these things or repeat these methods over time was a reminder that there's something substantial here. And I think Nietzsche's saying this as well, but what is substantial is something that can elucidate what we are. The goal here that Nietzsche's trying to get is not just to think these thoughts again, but to step outside of the most commonly thought thoughts in order to see why they emerge the way they do, and why they emerge in the way that they do so similarly over time periods, for the sake of hopefully coming up with better philosophies that are different. So, where there are linguistic affinities. Nietzsche's big on this. He thinks language will itself determine conceptual thought. The way that we latch onto certain concepts or certain terms, there's a reason why we like these terms. And Nietzsche's going to say, this is suspect. Right? There's going to be specific terms that are very tempting for a philosopher to think holds a key idea, but a lot of the times these concepts are the most problematic ones. And Nietzsche's already touched upon one of those concepts in the last aphorism, which is the will. The concept of a will or a free will is a concept as old as time, but Nietzsche thinks we get it wrong a lot, and he's going to try and reconceptualize what this will is to create new philosophy. So, and in order to do this, we need better grammar. We need to use language in new ways. So because of the common philosophy of grammar, due to the unconscious domination and direction through similar grammatical functions. The reason why humans want to use language in the way that we have for so long is rooted in unconscious domination of drives, affects, and desires, of which we can examine and question. Is our language being motivated and driven by the best sources? Something we can consider. It is obvious that everything lies ready from the very start for a similar development. So when you read a systematic philosopher, they set up their claims, they set up their definitions of things. Once they've done that, it's on its way. Those definitions determine the rest of the system, and a sequence of philosophical systems as a result. On the other hand, the way seems as good as blocked, passive language, for certain other possibilities of interpreting the world. And this is a central driving force for Nietzsche's philosophy throughout his entire life, is this explorer spirit, this creative spirit, right? The way seems good as blocked for other possibilities of interpreting the world to emerge. And if you bring up certain other interpretations of the world, there's a good chance you'll be met with a lot of resistance. Well, innocent resistance can take the form of just simple confusion, but more hostile resistance could be the form of blasphemy, right? So saying that there is no singular soul that is eternal is a blasphemous claim to the more serious Christians. But if you insist on believing in a singular soul that is eternal, hoo boy, that is a specific concept that's going to very much alter the way that you relate to yourself. That is one of those concepts that is potentially poisonous or potentially life-altering. You know, if you genuinely believe that you have this thing inside of you that is eternal, this soul, and that death will not harm you, well, you're operating on a whole nother level than I am. We are not the same beings. We do not see each other in the same way. We conceive of each other as totally different species. You think you're an eternal God-type entity, soul thing. I think I'm this appendage of like flesh that's alive for a while before it goes back into the dirt. So our conceptions of ourselves are rooted in these original ideas. These ideas and these terms dictate our own view of ourselves. And Nietzsche says a lot of the reasons are unconscious domination, so we're not even aware of the reasons why we are so invested in speaking and thinking of ourselves in the way that we do. So, philosophers of the Earl Altaic language group, so where the concept of the subject is most poorly developed, are more likely to see the world differently, to be found on different paths from those taken by the Germans or the Muslims. He says Indo-Germans. But this is a whole different approach to what we might call underdeveloped cultures than the likes of a Kant or Hegel. And Nietzsche here is more sensitive to valuing difference, instead of presuming that the West, this Indo-German Christo-Muslim Platonic development is just the one way that a lot of academics viewed it as, is just one way of seeing things, not the correct way of seeing things. And so Nietzsche is more willing to be open to seeing things differently. He's not making a value judgment here about these poorly developed. Actually, he doesn't even call the culture poorly developed. He says the concept of the subject is poorly developed. This is could be the very reason why we call it underdeveloped. Of course, there's material issues there as well. But anyway, the spell of particular grammatical functions. The spell of particular grammatical functions is, in the last analysis, the spell of physiological value judgments. So why do we like the words we like? Why do we use them? It's rooted in our psychology, in our conditioning, and in our values. So words are not nearly as objective or scientific as we take them to be, and Nietzsche's going to say that we need to use words in a better way, or a different way than they have been used in academic philosophy so far.